The following program was made possible by the generosity of those who have determined to hold fast to the true Roman Catholic religion, as expounded by the Roman Catholic Church before the disasters of Vatican II and the so-called New Mass.
The problem is that although they say that they intend to be faithful to Catholic tradition, they're actually not. Many of those who claim to be traditional Catholics are not really traditional Catholics. They claim to follow Catholic tradition, but they really don't. What does it mean to follow Catholic tradition? Well, I submit that there are three principles that traditional Catholics could accept and adhere to be traditional Catholics, in fact, not just in theory or in claim. And the first principle is this, that a traditional Catholic is one who will always and everywhere do what the Church herself has always and everywhere required the Catholic faithful to do. That a traditional Catholic is one who will follow without compromise what the Church has demanded of her children, to believe everything and to practice everything that the Church has said is necessary to believe and to practice to be Catholic. And if we look back in the history of the Church, we know exactly what that is. It is embodied in her catechisms, and it is embodied in her traditional rites. But there's a second principle which is every bit as important, and that is this. A traditional Catholic is one who will never do what the Church has always and everywhere condemned as being completely at variance with being Catholic. What the Church has said always and everywhere is evil and unacceptable for Catholics, and those who would be Catholics must not do these things, even to the point of being excommunicated if they do such things. So to reiterate that, a traditional Catholic is one who will never do what the Church has always and everywhere condemned as being antithetical to being Catholic, as being antithetical to Catholicism. Now there's a third principle, which I think is very important too here, and that completes the principles I think a traditional Catholic has to follow to be traditional Catholic. And that is this, that the traditional Catholic is one who will do what the Church has said the Catholic must do in a time of crisis. Now, that may be something that the Church ordinarily would not permit. But if you look back in the Church's history, in times of crisis, you find there are things that the Church permits and even requires that Catholics do that she would ordinarily not permit. For example, there was a saint named Tarcisius in the early centuries of the Church during the time of Roman persecution. Tarcisius was a young lad who was commissioned to carry the Blessed Sacrament in a little case called a pyx, P-Y-X, to the Christians condemned to die. They were imprisoned and waiting their execution. And anyone who would go to them would be seized upon as a fellow Christian and risked also being imprisoned and sentenced to death with them. So a brave lad, Tarcisius is his name, accepted the commission from the Pope himself to carry the Blessed Sacrament to them so they could receive our Lord in Holy Communion, to strengthen them for the ordeal ahead. Now, some have tried to make Tarcisius a deacon, even at the tender age of 12, to somehow coincide with subsequent tradition that only a deacon could carry the Blessed Sacrament, a deacon or a priest, or of course a bishop. But I don't know that there's any evidence that Tarcisius was ordained a deacon in order to fulfill this mission. In fact, we know the account of his death, that while he was on his way with the Blessed Sacrament secured, hanging around his neck and underneath his garments, his friends called to him. They spied him going by. They called to him. He wouldn't come to play with them. And so they ran to him, surrounded him, wondered why he was acting so strangely, discovered what he was doing, and put him to death. They killed him. His friends killed him right there for being a Christian. The Blessed Sacrament was saved because he clutched it so tightly they could not wrest his fingers away from the pyx. It was only a Christian soldier or even a priest, I believe, who came to claim the body. And at that point, Tarcisius released his grip, even in death, and released the Blessed Sacrament into worthy hands. But now, ordinarily, of course, it would never be permitted for a non-clergyman, even a clergyman of a lower order, to carry the Blessed Sacrament. It would never be permitted for a young lad to be entrusted with the Blessed Sacrament. But this was a time of persecution and a time of crisis. The Church will allow and even require Catholics to do certain things during times of crisis that ordinarily she would not require because they were not necessary. An example closer to our own day would be that of Father Miguel Pro, the great hero of the Cristeros in Mexico in the 1930s. And young Father Miguel Pro would actually leave Ciboria with the Blessed Sacrament in the private homes of the Catholic people when he would go to visit them. He would offer Mass. Of course, this was all very dangerous because just as in England 400 years before, and in the Empire of Rome 1,400 years before or so, it was a capital offense to do what he was doing and spread the faith, administer the sacraments to the Catholic people. And he would offer Mass and leave Ciboria with consecrated hosts in the homes of the people of Mexico City and wherever he was trying to serve Christ by sustaining the faith and the souls of the people and the hope and the love of God in the souls of the people. And the understanding was he was leaving in the custody of the father of the household, who would then be able to administer the Blessed Sacrament to members of his family. This was in time of persecution. It was in time of crisis. Was he condemned for doing this? Never. Did the Church even subsequently find him at fault for this? No. Father Pro died as a martyr, and his actions were considered to be very Catholic indeed, and heroically Catholic indeed. So you see what I mean by the third principle. There are things that the Church has taught us by her judgments throughout the centuries that not only are permitted for Catholics in time of crisis, but are actually to be praised and encouraged of the Catholic people in the time of crisis. Another example that I would give here would be consecrating bishops. For the first 6 centuries or so of the Church's existence, it was standard operating procedure. It was actually codified at the Council of Nicaea in the year 325 that bishops of a province would get together in council to choose and consecrate a bishop to replace one in their province who had died, rather than leaving the people without a bishop. In those days, communication with Rome was very hard, and sometimes perhaps nigh unto impossible during times of persecution. But even after the persecutions came to an end, the difficulties of communicating, the length of time necessary to communicate with Rome and to receive an answer and to make a choice of a candidate even to be nominated, to be consecrated, and then to be appointed to a position of authority in the Church, that would take long time. And the Church herself said that before even contacting the Holy See about the death of a bishop, the bishops should get together in council. They should choose one to succeed a deceased bishop, and not only should they then consecrate him, but they should put him in the place of authority in the church, and after they had done so, they should notify the Holy See. And so you see, it was, as I say, not only tolerated or permitted in the early days of the church, but as per the directives of the Council of Nicaea, this was how bishops were to proceed if one of the dioceses, one of the diocesan sees or provinces of the church was left bereft of a bishop by death. And so the fact that one would need to receive permission in advance to consecrate, even to place one in a position of authority, that was not in place in the early centuries of the church. The point being, it can't be intrinsically evil to do it. It's not a divine law. It is a human law. Now, sometime after that, a period of time, the church did change, saying that one needed the authority of the Holy See, the decision of the Holy See, in order to proceed that way. Okay, so that was a change that came in. As it became, let's say, more easily done to contact the Holy See and to receive authorization, the church changed that. But again, even then, in the 1200s, during the lifetime of St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Bonaventure, and so many great saints, when one pope died, almost 3 years passed before another pope was elected. And the bishops of certain areas died. Sometimes large sees with many thousands of souls lost their bishop to death. And rather than allow that to drag on for who knows how long, after a year had passed with no pope, after 2 years had passed with no supreme pontiff, no wonder the bishops of the area did what the church had done at the beginning. Got together and they would choose a successor for the bishop of a diocese. They would consecrate him and they would put him in place to govern the diocese. And finally, when the Pope successor of Peter was elected, yes, he certainly had the authority to ratify what they had done, but he certainly didn't undo what they had done. Quite the contrary, the church accepted what they did as the right thing to do, again, under those circumstances, when it simply was not possible to proceed without the authority of the Holy See. So, again, in our own time, the idea of bishops consecrating bishops, Catholic bishops consecrating Catholic bishops, to at least provide priests and sacraments for the Catholic people, not to take over dioceses, as had been done in the past, certainly, but to provide bishops who could consecrate priests and ensure the continuation of the powers of the sacrament and the mission of the church to justify and sanctify souls. That is very traditional in the church in times of crisis. We see that's what the church did. Now, here having summed all of that up, rather at length, I guess, with the last principle, I want to make the point that the reason for divisions among traditional Catholics, even though they are in principle united in faith, the doctrines of faith, in principle united in worship, and in principle even united in government, the command that they follow of sacred tradition, that the breakdown occurs because many of them are simply not traditional. They are not following the traditions of the church. Some would-be traditional groups are doing things that the church has always and everywhere condemned, doing things for which Catholic tradition gives them no precedent, no foundation. For example, suppose you came across a group of traditional priests, avowedly traditional priests, who claim to have the power to grant marriage annulments. Now, does the church provide any example of this in her history, where a group of priests unto themselves, or even, let's say, consecrated, even validly consecrated traditional bishops, could claim for themselves the magisterial authority to annul marriages? I would say no. I would say in the church's history there is no there's no case, at least that I know of, where, and I would doubt that there is such a case at all, where in times of crisis, a self-constituted traditional group of priests, rightly remaining traditional, but a self-constituted group of priests and with bishops consecrated by their own initiative, and I think justifiably so, Catholically so, but then they would take the step of saying, and we are the magisterium of the Catholic Church now, and we have the authority to grant marriage annulments. I don't think you'll find any precedent there for that. I think they're actually doing something that the Church has always and everywhere condemned. I would not consider them to be traditional, certainly not in that. Let's say you find a group of avowedly traditional priests who say, well, we see what's happening in the Vatican, and we don't even know that the one who is presenting himself to the world as the successor of Peter, the vicar of Christ on earth, we're not even sure that he has the Catholic faith. So that when we stand before the altar and offer Mass, we're not even sure that we can say that we are one in faith with, right now, what the world knows as Pope Francis. That we don't know that we can honestly say that we are one in faith with him because we're not sure that he even has the Catholic faith. Some might even say that they are sure he doesn't have the Catholic faith. But all the more so, how then could they stand at the altar, invoke Francis's name, in doing something that he does not authorize and that he would tell them they must not do, they would command them not to do, offer the traditional Mass without the reference to his bishops, and claim to have his faith and share faith with him? How could a group of traditional clergymen do this, claim that therefore he is the Pope, and everybody in the world has to accept that he is the Pope, and then turn around and in practice not obey him, and not recognize, as I say, in practice, only in pretense, but not in practice, that he has any authority to command them, because they essentially do nothing that he tells them to do. To recognize somebody as a true Pope, and then to, in practice, say that he has no real authority to command me and to tell me what to do, is what the Church has defined as schism. Now, there are people in the world today who do not believe that Francis is the Pope. At least they're not convinced of it. Even if they're not willing to say he isn't, they are not really convinced that he is because they do not know that he has the Catholic faith. So they couldn't honestly stand at the altar as priests and say that they're una cum Papa Nostro, one in faith with Francis, when they offer Mass. And they could not tell the world, you have to believe that he's the Pope, and all traditional Catholics and traditional clergy must accept him as the Pope. But in fact, of course, we don't have to do anything he says. That's not Catholic to do that. That is something the Catholic Church has always condemned as being schismatic. Those who have real serious doubts, objective doubts about the papacy of Francis, even if they're not willing to say, I'm convinced he's not the Pope, if they're willing just to say, well, I'm not sure he is, because I'm not sure he has the Catholic faith, they would not be schismatic for not obeying him. In fact, they would be required not to obey him insofar as they doubt that he really has the authority of the Pope after all, as they doubt he has the faith of the Church. So those who have objective doubts concerning his papacy, even if they're not willing to say he isn't for sure, certainly he's not the Pope, those who just doubt that, but for good reasons, would be required not to obey what he commands when they see that it is antithetical to what the Church has taught and requires the Catholics to do. But those who claim that he is the Pope for sure, with no doubt, they can't just dismiss him and say that they have no obligation to obey anything he says. That is, as I said, the very definition of schism. So you see, there are traditional Catholic groups, at least in terms of what I'm talking about here, who really are not traditional, despite what they say about being traditional and following Catholic tradition. And as a last example, I would use the example of the Thuc bishops. There's been a great deal of talk about them, a great deal of controversy. Archbishop Pierre Martin Nodin Thuc was a bishop in Hue, Vietnam. And he was a real Catholic bishop, a real Catholic archbishop. Actually a member of the Diem family, the ruling family in Vietnam during the Vietnam War, during Vatican II, actually. And Archbishop Thuc began to do some very strange things, you see. Especially after the murder of members of his family and the dispossession of all of his goods. He found himself in Rome at Vatican II when his family was assassinated, where there was a coup, and his property was confiscated and essentially had no country to go back to. So he became a refugee. And at least after that point, he began to act and speak very strangely. Even at Vatican II, he was speaking very strangely. Subsequent to that, though, he went on to be enlisted by some traditional Catholic groups, and he wound up consecrating a number of bishops. The list of bishops he consecrated is kind of a rogues gallery for the most part. He consecrated some non-Catholics, actually, those who had left the Catholic faith, even started religious bodies, churches of their own, apart from the Catholic Church. He consecrated them, bishops. Now, again, those who want to follow, or shall we say, be associated with and receive holy orders from the lineage of Archbishop Thuc, those he consecrated as bishops, have to reckon with a very serious problem, and that is that what Archbishop Thuc did was considered a crime against the Church. Not just a sin, but an actual crime against the faith in consecrating non-Catholic bishops. This is in violation of the second principle that I gave you shortly ago, and that is that a traditional Catholic will never do what the Church always and everywhere condemns as being forbidden by the Church, forbidden by God, completely at odds with what it is to be a Catholic. Archbishop Thuc did these things. There are some who try to excuse him from responsibility by saying that he was not mentally sound at that point, that his mind was clouded, and so that he acted with this mental handicap, as it were. But then that raises a question, if that explanation is true, that raises the question about the validity of the consecrations that he did. If they want to excuse him of responsibility for the crimes that he committed against the unity of the Church by consecrating non-Catholics, something the Church has always and everywhere condemned, then one would have to say he wasn't responsible because of some incapacity in his mind. But again, as I say, this puts in doubt the validity of the consecrations he did. But if he was acting with the necessary faculties and rationality, being quite fully aware of what he was doing and responsible for his actions, well, then he would be subject to the penalty of the Church, which ipso facto excommunicates those who do such things. As Pope Pius XII wrote in his encyclical to the bishops of China in 1958, consecrating bishops without any precedent, contra omne facie, against all the practice of the Church. Now, I mentioned before that it was a part of the practice of the Church to consecrate bishops at some times in crisis, but it was never the practice of the Church to consecrate non-Catholics. She always condemned that as a grave, not only sin, but crime. So, the fact that Archbishop did these things, and is even acknowledged to have done these things by those who support him, or those who claim their holy orders from him, the line coming from him, they have a serious problem. They have to sweep this under the rug and say it really doesn't count. They have to find a way to explain it away, and do it in such a way that it doesn't undermine the case for the validity of the consecrations he did. But the fact is, this is something the Church has always condemned. I would dare say that there is not a single case that is verifiable in the history of the Catholic Church that a bishop consecrated a non-Catholic with the foregoing approval of the Church, or with the subsequent approval of the Church, that the Church okayed what he did, but that this was always condemned. And now we have Archbishop Thuc, who's done these things, and yet he is the spiritual founder, as it were, of this whole line of bishops, claiming to be traditional. Can a bishop who is automatically excommunicated from the Church for a crime against the faith, can he then turn around and produce Catholic bishops? Can he then turn around and consecrate Catholic bishops in the name of the Church, when he's been automatically excommunicated specialissimo modo reservata a sancta sede, in the most special manner, in the most severe manner of automatic excommunication, an excommunication that is considered so severe for a crime so grave that that excommunication can be lifted only by the Holy See itself? Can a bishop who is struck with such an excommunication for such a crime then claim to turn around and produce Catholic bishops? I maintain it's impossible. But this is the issue with regard to Archbishop Thuc. It simply cannot be swept under the rug. It cannot be ignored. There are certain apologists for what Archbishop Thuc did, who say, well, in the old Code of Canon Law, the 1918 Code of Canon Law, it says that a bishop, that if someone would receive unauthorized orders, if someone would receive unauthorized holy orders in the Church, that he would be subject to suspension, subject to irregularity, which simply meant that he could not function with the orders given, the orders received. He couldn't function as a Catholic clergyman with these orders because of this censure. But the law did not say that he was automatically excommunicated. So there are some who actually try to argue that the Church doesn't consider that to be a grave crime. But I would suggest that their attempt to use that as an argument to justify, or at least minimize, what Archbishop Thuc did, shows the weakness and even the dishonesty of their position. Because, in the first place, if the Church in the old code leveled a censure of irregularity and suspension, such that if someone received holy orders irregularly within the Church, he could not use them, it wasn't because the Church was saying it's not that serious. What the Church would do is put on ice that, or put that on hold, investigate, find out exactly what happened, and then excommunicate those if there was something very seriously wrong about what they'd done. The Church's immediate reaction was to freeze that and not allow them to function within the Church with the orders that they'd received illegitimately. And as I say, then if the next step would be the Church could excommunicate them if what they were doing was that seriously wrong. What Pope Pius XII did in 1951 was order the Holy Office. The Pope is the prefect of the Holy Office. So he ordered the Holy Office, the highest congregation in the church to issue that decree of excommunication for anyone who would perpetrate an unauthorized consecration of a bishop. And as I say, traditionally we could say that does not preclude consecrating bishops in time of crisis, because we have precedent for that in the church. But it would be contrary to all the practice of the church to consecrate a non-Catholic. And that takes me to another point with regard to that claim that the Old Code did not excommunicate for that. The fact is that the Old Code presumed that that a Catholic was being ordained or consecrated by a Catholic. Certainly didn't envision the case of a Catholic bishop consecrating a non-Catholic. That was not what the Code was talking about. So again, I think even appealing to that shows the weakness of the case, and I think to some extent even the dishonesty of the case. So this is an example of, again, violating that second principle that Catholics will never do. Traditional Catholics will never do what the Church has always and everywhere condemned. And the Church has always and everywhere condemned this: consecrating as bishops non-Catholics. The ironic thing is that the very Thuc line clergy who are willing to accept this from Archbishop Thuc and to justify it for themselves would be outraged if Francis were to do such a thing as consecrate a non-Catholic a bishop. They would condemn that with merciless, just even ridicule and outrage. But they are willing to, as it were, give a pass to what Archbishop Thuc did. And I, again, consider this to be less than honest. And we need to try to appeal to those who would be traditional Catholics to follow Catholic tradition. I would ask them all to explain to me why these three principles are not worthy to be taken to appeal to what it is to be traditional Catholic. And if they don't object to them, then why they do not follow them. Why they will persist in doing things that the Church has always and everywhere condemned. Well, in any case, I hope this has been somewhat helpful. I apologize for speaking at such length, but I do think it is of the utmost importance that the traditional Catholic people define what they mean. What are the principles they follow, so that they can adhere to them and be not only in claim, but be in fact traditional Catholics. May God bless you.